Welcome to another episode of Capital Cannabis. I'm your host, Kimberly Krepp, and let's start off by saying free all of our pot prisoners. Anti-marijuana laws are a crime against humanity. People seeking justice work on either overturning laws with new legislation or by establishing a judicial precedent. The Capital District Cannabis Consortium, New York for Cannabis, is a homegrown movement dedicated to the honest education about cannabis and the full repeal of cannabis prohibition. It is our main goal to educate the community about the true history and facts about cannabis, a renewable, sustainable, and once vital natural resource, and to demand the descheduling and exemption of cannabis from the DEA's Controlled Substances Act, and to demand the full repeal of all federal, state, and local criminal and civil penalties for this plant called cannabis. We say make it lawful, don't make it legal, and we're starting the cannabis conversation where it starts. So what is cannabis anyway, and why is it so taboo? Well, first, let's really knock out the argument of hemp versus cannabis. Hemp is just a term used to classify cannabis strains with less than 0.3% THC. Marijuana is a term used to describe cannabis strains with more than 0.3% THC. That's all. Cannabis, aka marijuana, aka the reefer, aka the sticky icky, is a so-called psychoactive drug from the cannabis plant that can be used for spiritual, medicinal, and recreational purposes, and in fact has thousands of uses such as food, fiber, oil, fuel, building materials. And there are three types of species of this plant: the Cannabis sativa, Cannabis indica, and Cannabis ruderalis. But we can argue if ruderalis even belongs on this list to begin with. Cannabis ruderalis was first introduced by Russian botanist D.E. Januszewski in 1924 and is native to Central and Eastern Europe and Russia. Smaller than sativa or indica, it rarely grows over 2 feet tall. It has thin fibrous stems with little branching. Ruderalis, which is traditionally used for folk medicine, has little THC and is rarely used for recreational purposes. Because ruderalis transitions from the vegetative stage to the flowering stage with age as opposed to the light cycle required with photoperiod strains like indica and sativa, ruderalis is often bred with other household sativa and indica strains of cannabis to create auto-flowering cannabis strains in the commercial industry. Cannabis sativa, first classified by Carl Linnaeus in 1753, is also a source of food, fiber, fuel, and medicine with thousands of industrial purposes, and it has been used for recreational, religious, and spiritual purposes. Sativa is native to Eastern Asia. In 1785, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, a French biologist, published a description of a second species of cannabis, which he named Cannabis indica, basing his description on the newly named species of plant specimens collected in India, originating in the Hindu Kush mountain range. Resembling sativa, indica is also a source of food, fiber, fuel, and medicine with thousands of industrial purposes, and it also used for recreational, religious, and spiritual purposes. However, there are several key differences between Cannabis indica and Cannabis sativa. These include height, stature, internodal length, leaf size and structure, bud size and density, flowering time, odor, and even smoke and effects. Indica can be described as a relatively short, conical, and densely branched plant with broad leaflets, whereas sativa is tall with laxly branched and very thin leaflets. Cannabis indica or sativa plants in the vegetative growth phase of its life requires more than 12 to 13 hours of light per day to stay vegetative. Flowering only occurs when darkness equals at least 12 hours per day. The flowering cycle can last anywhere between 9 and 15 weeks, depending on the strain and environmental conditions. When the production of sinsemilla or seedless as sought, female plants are grown separately from male plants. This increases the production of cannabinoid-rich resin. In the soil, the optimum pH for the plant is 6.3 to 6.8. In hydroponic growing, the nutrient solution is best at 5.2 to 5.8, making cannabis well suited for hydroponics because the pH range is very hostile to most bacteria and fungi. Tissue culture multiplication has become important in producing clones, while seed production remains the preferred means of multiplication. But if you have a good strain, you should definitely clone it so you can keep it going. Clone the mama plant. Because of the harsh and extremely cold winters and warm summers, indica is very well suited for cultivation in the greater Northeast. So let's really get into the history of cannabis and prohibition in the United States. So currently, medical cannabis is legal in 33 states and DC, including New York, while recreational cannabis is legal in 11, but not here in the Excelsior state. Oh no, not here. Cuomo hasn't figured a way to screw us with the taxes yet. They really trying to hit on that 44% and keep it right out of our hands. No grow. So historically, cannabis has been used for thousands of years throughout various cultures for spiritual, industrial, and recreational purposes, and has even been found in the tombs over 3,000 years old in China, as well as South American archaeological digs. North America's first cannabis crop was planted in 1606 by Louis Herbe, who had emigrated to New France, which is now Nova Scotia. Cannabis was a crucial world economy at that time. In Asia, it was used for food and medicine, while in Europe, it was mainly grown to make ropes and sails. Huge amounts of cannabis textiles were needed by all of Europe's naval powers to outfit their warships and merchant vessels. Unable to meet their own demand, European monarchs began looking abroad. Britain bought large amounts of cannabis sails and ropes from Russia, while the Dutch imported cannabis from the East Indies. By the mid-1600s, Spain was growing cannabis in Chile, New England was growing cannabis for Britain, and the French Royal Warehouse promised to buy all the cannabis Canadian farmers could grow. To encourage more cannabis farming in New France, the French government offered bonuses and distributed cannabis seeds to settlers. Some taxes could also be paid with cannabis stalks, and farmers who did not grow enough were often punished. As I mentioned, Britain also looked at the colonies to support the cannabis needs. In 1611, by order of King James I, every colonist had to supply 100 hemp crops to the Virginia Company for shipment back to England. The majority of Virginia's hemp was grown by small farmers and used for manufacturing of ropes and cordage. Sail-making factories multiplied all over the colony to supply these naval needs, and if any man worked at these jobs for at least 6 months, he was excused from military duty. Cannabis was more valuable than cash as paper, because paper money had no value. $1,000 in Virginia currency was only worth $1 in silver. Due to the lack of faith in paper currency, the economy operated on a barter system. People traded. Cannabis's comparative uniformity, freedom from deterioration, and universal demand for its value has exceeded all other raw produce, which has been recognized, as a studied commodity for the first 3 to 4 decades of the new republic. So restrictions on cannabis as a drug really started in local laws in New York in 1860 and by state law in the 1910s and 1920s. The Federal Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was created, and the intended targets being those who mislabeled or polluted drugs with undisclosed narcotics, and regulated the labeling of patent medicines that contained cannabis indica as well. In 1925, the U.S. supported regulation of Indian hemp was used as a drug in the International Opium Convention, whose recommendations inspired the work for the Uniform State Narcotic Act between 1925 and 1935. Andrew Mellon, banker, industrialist, and politician, also owner of the Bank of Mellon, the Bank of New York, the financial backer for DuPont and their newest product called nylon. He was the founder of Gulf Oil Corporation and knew that cannabis is an alternative raw material for the production of thousands of products, including fuel and plastics, which have allowed to compete in the free market would threaten the future products of the oil company and DuPont. And as U.S. Secretary to the Treasury, Mellon created the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and recruited his future nephew-in-law, Harry Anslinger, because the man really had a plan. Harry Anslinger served as the first commissioner of the U.S. Treasury Department of Federal Bureau of Narcotics during the presidencies of Hoover, Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy. He was a staunch supporter of prohibition and criminalization of drugs, as well as a notorious racist who supported the victimization of African Americans while spreading anti-drug policy campaigns. Anslinger held office for an unprecedented 32 years in his role of commissioner until 1962. He then held office as the U.S. representative to the United Nations Narcotics Commission. Anslinger had not been active in the campaign against cannabis until about 1930. Prior to the end of Prohibition, he had claimed that cannabis was not a problem, and I quote, "There is probably no more absurd fallacy than the idea that it makes people violent." Critics argue that he shifted stances not due to the objective evidence, but self-interest due to the obsolescence of the Department of Prohibition that he had headed when alcohol prohibition ended. Now he was campaigning for a new prohibition against something to use. William Randolph Hearst was a businessman, newspaper publisher, and politician known for developing the nation's largest newspaper chain and media company called Hearst Communications. Hearst was known for printing gigantic headlines over lurid stories featuring stories of crime, corruption, sex, and innuendo. After creating a chain of almost 30 papers in major American cities at its peak, he also expanded to magazines while controlling the editorial positions and coverage of political news in all of his papers and magazines, often publicizing his views as fact.
These high school boys and girls are having a hop at the local soda fountain. Innocently they dance, innocent of a new and deadly menace lurking behind closed doors. Marijuana, the burning weed with its roots in hell. In this film, you will see the ease with which this vicious plant can be grown in your neighbor's yard, rolled into harmless-looking cigarettes, hidden in an innocent shoe or watch case.
If you want a good smoke, try one of these.
You will meet Bill, who once took pride in his strong will as he takes the first step toward enslavement.
Of course, if you're afraid.
Smoking the soul-destroying reefer, they find a moment's pleasure, but at a terrible price. Debauchery, violence, murder, suicide, and the ultimate end of the marijuana addict.
Plague bastard.
Hopeless insanity. See this important film now, before it is too late.
As director of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Anslinger would later use the sensational and totally fabricated articles published by William Randolph Hearst to push the Marijuana Tax Act through Congress, which successfully destroyed the cannabis industry. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act sort of criminalized cannabis. When I say sort of, I mean that the act did not criminalize cannabis, it criminalized you. If you did not purchase the appropriate tax stamp to possess cannabis from the federal government. The act was pushed through Congress by being sent to the House Ways and Means Committee. The House Ways and Means Committee could send a bill directly to the floor without the debate of committees and introduced as law. After the enactment, during an unsuccessful appeal, William Woodward, physician and attorney for the American Medical Association, stated that the entire fabric of federal testimony was tabloid sensationalism. No real testimony had been heard, and that the Marijuana Tax Act was passed in ignorance, and it could possibly deny the world the potential medicine in marijuana. The only reason Woodward had not come out sooner was that he had realized 2 days before the hearing that the plant Congress intended to outlaw was cannabis, a benign substance used to treat treat illnesses for over 100 years in America. In 1938, New York City Mayor LaGuardia requested that the New York Academy of Medicine conduct an investigation on marijuana. The 1944 report titled Marijuana Problem in the City of New York was commonly referred to as LaGuardia Report, which confirms that many claims about the dangers of marijuana are exaggerated or untrue. But the appeal was still lost. In 1941, Henry Ford presented a groundbreaking invention, a hemp fuel-powered cellulose plastic prototype car. The panels, composed of 70% cellulose fiber, proved to have the impact strength 10 times stronger than steel, and the car was run on hemp ethanol.
Amongst the thousands of products made from hemp, one of the most extraordinary is Henry Ford's plastic car. Built in 1941, it contained cellulose fibers derived from hemp, sisal, and wheat straw. The plastic was lighter than steel, yet could withstand 10 times the impact without denting.
Long ago, when these ancient Grecian temples were new, hemp was already old in the service of mankind. For thousands of years even then, this plant had been grown for cordage and coarse cloth in China and elsewhere in the East. For centuries prior to about 1850, all the ships that sailed the western seas were rigged with hempen rope and sails. For the sailor, no less than the hangman, hemp was indispensable. A 44-gun frigate, like our cherished old Ironsides, took over 60 tons of hemp for rigging. Including an anchor cable 25 inches in circumference. The Conestoga wagons and prairie schooners of pioneer days were covered with hempen canvas. Indeed, the very word canvas comes from the Arabic word for hemp. In those days, hemp was an important crop in Kentucky and Missouri. Then came cheaper imported fibers for cordage, like jute, sisal, and manila hemp, and the culture of hemp in America declined. But now, with Philippine and East Indian sources of hemp in the hands of the Japanese, and shipment of jute from India curtailed, American hemp must meet the needs of our Army and Navy as well as of our industries. In 1942, patriotic farmers at the government's request planted 36,000 acres of seed hemp, an increase of several thousand%. The goal for 1943 is 50,000 acres of seed hemp. In Kentucky, much of the seed hemp acreage is on river bottom land such as this, along the Kentucky River Gorge. Some of these fields are inaccessible except by boat. Thus, plans are afoot for a great expansion of the hemp industry as a part of the war program. This film is designed to tell farmers how to handle this ancient crop, now little known outside Kentucky and Wisconsin. This is hemp seed. Be careful how you use it. For to grow hemp legally, you must have a federal registration and tax stamp. This is provided for in your contract. Ask your AAA committeeman or your county agent about it. Don't forget, hemp demands a rich, well-drained soil such as is found here in the bluegrass region of Kentucky or in central Wisconsin. It must be loose and rich in organic matter. Poor soils won't do. Soil that will grow good corn will usually grow hemp. Hemp is not hard on the soil. In Kentucky, it has been grown for several years on the same ground, though this practice is not recommended. A dense and shady crop, hemp tends to choke out weeds. Here's a Canada thistle that couldn't stand the competition. Dead as a dodo. Thus, hemp leaves the ground in good condition for the following crop. For fiber, hemp should be sown 5 pecks to the acre. With drill, the closer the rows, the better. These rows are spaced about 4 inches. This hemp has been broadcast. Either way, it should be sown thick enough to grow a slender stalk. Here's an ideal stand. The right height to be harvested easily, thick enough to grow slender stalks that are easy to cut and process. Stalks like these here on the left, they yield the most fiber and the best. Those on the right are too coarse and woody. For seed, hemp is planted in hills like corn, sometimes by hand. Hemp is a dioecious plant. The female flower is inconspicuous, but the male flower is easily spotted. In seed production, after the pollen has been shed, these male plants are cut out. These are the seeds on a female plant. Hemp for fiber is ready to harvest when the pollen is shedding and the leaves are falling. In Kentucky, hemp harvest comes in August. Here, the old standby has been the self-rake Reefer, which has been used for a generation or more. Hemp grows so luxuriantly in Kentucky that harvesting is sometimes difficult, which may account for the popularity of the self-rake with its lateral stroke. A modified rice binder has been used to some extent. This machine works well in average hemp. Recently, the improved hemp harvester, used for many years in Wisconsin, has been introduced in Kentucky. This machine spreads the hemp in a continuous swath. It is a far cry from this fast and efficient modern harvester to the Armstrong model of yore. But here's one kind of harvester, at least, that doesn't stall in the heaviest hemp. In Kentucky, hand cutting is practiced in opening fields for the machines. In Kentucky, hemp is shucked as soon as safe after cutting, to be spread out for retting later in the fall. In Wisconsin, hemp is harvested in September. Here, the hemp harvester with automatic spreader is standard equipment. Note how smoothly the rotating apron lays the swath preparatory to retting. Here it is a common and essential practice to leave headlands around hemp fields. These strips may be planted to other crops, preferably small grain. Thus, the harvester has room to make its first round without preparatory hand cutting. Here the machine is running over corn stubble. When the cutter bar is much shorter than the hemp is tall, overlapping occurs. Not so good for retting. The standard cut is 8 to 9 feet. The length of time hemp is left on the ground to ret depends on the weather. The swaths must be turned to get a uniform ret. When the woody core breaks away readily, like this, the hemp is about ready to take up and bind into bundles. Well-retted hemp is light to dark gray. The fiber tends to pull away from the stalk. The presence of stalks in the bowstring stage indicates that retting is well underway. When hemp is short or tangled, or when the ground is too wet for machines, it is bound by hand. a wooden buck is used. Twine will do for tying, but the hemp itself makes a good band. When conditions are favorable, the pickup binder is commonly used. The swaths should lie smooth and even with stalks parallel. The picker won't work well in tangled hemp. After binding, hemp is shucked as soon as possible to stop further retting. In 1942, 14,000 acres of fiber hemp were harvested in the United States. The goal for 1943 is 300,000 acres. Thus, hemp, Cannabis sativa, the old standby cordage fiber, is staging a strong comeback. This is Kentucky hemp going into the dryer of a mill at Versailles. In the old days, breaking was done by hand, one of the hardest jobs known to man. Now the power breaker makes quick work of it. Spinning American hemp into rope yarn or twine in the old Kentucky River Mill at Frankfort, Kentucky. Another pioneer plant that has been making cordage for more than a century. All such plants will presently be turning out products spun from American-grown hemp. Twine of various kinds for tying, winding armatures, and upholsterers' work. Rope for marine rigging and towing, for hay forks, derricks, and heavy-duty tackle. Light-duty fire hose. Thread for shoes for millions of American soldiers. And parachute webbing for our paratroopers. As for the United States Navy, every battleship requires 34,000 feet of rope, and other craft accordingly. So here in the Boston Navy Yard, where cables for frigates were made long ago, crews are now working night and day making cordage for the fleet. In the old days, rope yarn was spun by hand. Today, even the rope walk is mechanized. 160 fathoms to go. The rope yarn feeds through holes in an iron plate. This is Manila hemp from the Navy's rapidly dwindling reserve. When that is gone, American hemp will go on duty again. Hemp for mooring ships, hemp for tow lines. Hemp for tackle and gear. Hemp for countless naval uses, both on ship and shore. Just as in the days when old Ironside sailed the seas victorious, with her hempen shrouds and hempen sails. for victory.